president of Peru, Pedro Castillo, and his cabinet of ministers announced measures to face fuel prices rise and to respond to transportation workers' protests due to the energy crisis. Castillo also announced the lifting of the curfew imposed to control the demonstrations. The United Nations Security Council meets to address the allegations of killings of civilians in the town of Bucha in Ukraine by Western media. The South African government ended the national state of disaster and lifted several anti-COVID-19 measures. Hello, welcome to From the South. I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada Cruz, from the teleSUR studios in Caracas, Venezuela. We begin with the news. Stay with us. And now we begin. In Peru, President Pedro Castillo appears before the Congress of the Republic in response to an invitation from the board of directors of the legislative body. Castillo arrived at the Legislative Palace at 3 p.m. local time, accompanied by a group of ministers, in order to seek a solution to the transport workers' strike. The invitation by the Congress comes after the Peruvian president ordered on April 4th the immobility of citizens, a curfew, a fact considered by the defenders of the people as unconstitutional. In this regard, President Castillo ratified the disposition of his government to dialogue in order to reach a joint solution. At the beginning of the dialogue, President Pedro Castillo announced the lifting of the curfew and other mobility restrictions imposed to control the demonstrations. In Colombia, with less than 2 months to go before the presidential elections, new polls show as favorite the presidential formula of the historical pact. This was revealed in a recent study by the National Consultancy Center, which indicates that Gustavo Petro will occupy the first place in the elections of May 29th with a voting intention of 36.5%, 4 points more in comparison with the survey carried out by this institute in March. This survey also revealed that the candidate of the coalition Equipo por Colombia, Colombia team, Federico Gutiérrez, achieved a voting intention of 24.5%, which means 1 point more in comparison to the last survey. Taking into account these results, Pedro and Gutiérrez will be the candidates who will go on to the second round for the presidency of the Republic. Colombian vice presidential candidate Francia Márquez, running mate of leftist Gustavo Petro, denounced on Monday that she has suffered 3 threats to exterminate her in less than a month, for which she demanded guarantees for her political exercise. Márquez, an Afro-descendant and social leader, said that they want to impose terror in Colombia and attach a photograph of a pamphlet in which the paramilitary organization Águilas Negras threatens her. This is the 3rd threat I have received in less than a month, said Márquez, adding that they have also threatened her running mate, presidential candidate Gustavo Petro. In her letter, the Black Eagles threatened to kill all those who claim to be Democrats, social leaders, and human rights defenders, but who in the end are only guerrilla fighters hiding behind legality. In Ecuador, the government informed that it will have the support from different international entities to face the conflicts of violence, insecurity, and drug trafficking. On Tuesday, President Guillermo Lasso acknowledged that it will take time to control the situation of violence in the country. However, he indicated that with the help of several governments, it will be possible to overcome the situation generated by national and international criminal gangs involved in drug trafficking. The head of the state also said that the decision to seek the contribution of other governments was taken after the April 3rd riot in a prison in the south of the country, which left at least 20 dead. Lasso did not rule out as a possible solution to the problem of prison violence the construction of another maximum security prison with modern technology. In Bolivia, health workers have suspended the call for a national strike that was to begin on Tuesday, 5 of April, after the national government announced the creation of a working group to listen to the union's demands. The Doctors Association was planning a blockade of 1,000 healthcare services with the aim of demanding that the national government pay attention to their demands. The union has been demanding the institutionalization of positions of the payments of the collective disability insurance and the annulment of the health emergency law by COVID-19. In the midst of the situation, the Minister of Health, Jason Ausa, called for dialogue while appealing to the responsibility of the doctors so that they do not deprive the Bolivian people of the right to the life. Indigenous people celebrate the second day of the 18th edition of the Free Land Camp outside the Congress in Brasilia. The largest indigenous mobilization in Brazil, where people from all over the country come to defend the rights of ancestral communities and to reject the advance in the Congress of bill proposed by the ultra-right-wing government of Jair Bolsonaro, who pursues to open up indigenous territories to mining activities. The Free Land Camp began on April 4th and runs until April 14th. The organizers expect to mobilize between 7,000 and 8,000 indigenous people from all over the nation.
Today, there are several bills in Congress that open up indigenous territories to mining, and also the Draft Law 191 today strengthens these advances within our territories. And this act here is to say no, that these bills cannot move forward. The Amazon is discussed a lot, the preservation of the environment, the preservation of the rivers, but one thing is not discussed. It is the preservation of the lives of the people who live in the Amazon, who live in this country, and especially this indigenous population that is responsible today for keeping alive the biodiversity of this country. The Amazon is not just green, it is not just a river, the Amazon is us.
And now we move on to other topics. The Argentinian government announced the implementation of a coupon to counteract the loss of purchasing power following the inflation's impact. The authorities explained that minimum wage retirees and pensioners will collect the additional 6,000 peso bonus, equivalent to $52, as an aid to face the country's inflation and, in particular, the increase in food prices. The head of the National Social Security Administration, Fernanda Raberta, said the payment of the coupon will benefit 4.6 million retirees and pensioners. The money will start to be deposited in regular accounts as from April 18th, an ID number-based order. We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back to From the South. The United Nations Security Council met to address the alleged killing of civilians in the town of Bucha in Ukraine. During the day's debate, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, requested an independent investigation into the events in the city of Bucha. Meanwhile, the representative of the government of Russia, Vasilin Nebenzia, rejected the veto made by the United Kingdom on 2 occasions against the intention of carrying out this discussion in the Security Council. The official also denounced that neo-Nazi groups operating in Ukraine are attacking civilians and using them as human shields amid the special military operation carried out by Moscow in the Donbas region.
And they're not just killing Russian or prisoner soldiers, on which they torture and gloat about it on the social media, but they kill their own. Your neo-Nazis and radicals have shown unrivaled cruelty against the civilians, which they use as human shields, and position heavy artillery next to residential buildings and multiple rocket launchers as well. Today we've heard once again a huge amount of lies about Russian soldiers and military. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of video testimonials of people who are ready to provide testimony about the cruelty of Ukrainian nationals.
Nebenzia also warned that Ukrainian authorities manipulated audio-visual material related to the events in the city of Bucha.
Already after the withdrawal of the Russian forces, the mayor of Bucha, Anatoly Fedoruk, in his video statement on the 31st of March, presented this as a heroic liberation of the city by the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, let's set aside its so-called liberation, and let's focus on the fact that he confirmed the fact on the 31st of March that there were no more Russian soldiers in the town on the 31st of March. Furthermore, the mayor did not mention any local inhabitants with their hands tied and having been shot. I mean, could you believe that the mayor would not have noticed on the streets, as reported, of 280 corpses? He wouldn't have noticed that?
And addressing the Security Council, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky questioned on UN security guarantees. At the same time, the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the UN, Vasily Nebezia, warned of inaccuracies in the Ukrainian and Western versions of the Bucha's events.
So where is the security that the Security Council needs to guarantee? It's not there, although there is a Security Council. Where is that peace? Where are those guarantees that the United Nations needs to guarantee? It is obvious that the key institution of the world, which must ensure the coercion of any aggression to peace, simply cannot work effectively. And now we're seeing blatant criminally staged events with the Ukrainian civilians that were killed by the radicals in the best traditions of Goebbels to accuse the Russian army. Those killed in the areas from which the Russian forces withdrew after encouraging peace negotiations in Istanbul. Now it turns out that we shouldn't have withdrawn. I'm talking about Bucha first and foremost. I understand that you were shown courses and heard testimonies, but you have only saw what they have shown you. You cannot ignore the inconsistencies in the version of events which are being promoted by the Ukrainian and Western media.
And the situation in the besieged port of Mariupol in southeastern Ukraine has become worse for citizens who are trying to leave the combat zone since the Russian military operation in late February. Our correspondent Alejandro Kirk brings us more details.
This is a small town of Sartana in the outskirts of Mariupol. These people behind me are refugees. They are trying to leave the combat zone to a safer area in the People's Republic of Donetsk. On our trip here, we saw lots of scenes of devastation. People were telling us how the Ukrainian forces and the Nazi militias that accompany them using civilian facilities, houses, hospitals, restaurants as human shields against the Russian offensive. Just being here now, we are hearing the shelling. We have seen helicopters coming over to the combat zone that seems to be on our left, where they are trying to take over the Azovstal factory where the remaining Ukrainian forces are hiding. We spoke here in Sartana with a local leader. This is what he had to say.
Ukrainians would set up armor or mortars or some kind of weapon in the hospital, and they would shoot at the Russians so that the retaliation would come to the hospital. They were patients. I was there. After shooting, they would go, provoking the Russian response towards the hospital. A Russian plane flew over, apparently shot down by a missile. I turned around, I saw it flying towards me through the window. But the plane released a defense missile, and it landed right below my window at the second floor level, and there was an explosion there. The windows of the pavilion blew out with the tourists on top of it. It was horrible what was happening. It was buried literally 10 steps from the building without exploding.
This is it for now from Sartana, Mariupol, Donbass.
Thank you, Alejandro, for your collaboration. And Vladimir Putin condemned measures taken against Russian gas giant Gazprom in Europe over the conflict in Ukraine and warned of potential reprisals. Putin addressed officials in a televised meeting after Germany said on Monday it was temporarily taking control of Gazprom's German subsidiary.
The situation in the energy sector is worsening as a result of non-market brute measures, including administrative pressure on our company Gazprom in some European countries. We are already hearing statements from officials about the possible nationalization of our assets. If we go that far, let's not forget that this is a double-edged sword.
The European Union has just agreed on new coercive measures against Russia this Tuesday. The High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy of the European Union, Josep Borrell, announced a new package of sanctions against Russia due to the situation in Ukraine. Borrell detailed that the members of the European Union intend to approve new coercive measures. However, he assured that they are still debating what to do with the issue of Russian energy and gas, since there are countries that depend directly on Russia. So far, several Western nations have implemented sanctions against Moscow after it recognized the self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. And we have more news coming up after a final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. In South Africa, local authorities ended the national state of disaster, the legal framework used for 2 years to impose restrictions to combat the pandemic. According to the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, most restrictions will be lifted, but people will be required to wear masks in indoor public spaces. And international travelers must provide proof of vaccination or a negative PCR test done within 72 hours. Opposition parties, which were pressuring to the government to lift the state of disaster, welcomed the decision. It was also supported by the business and tourism sector, saying it will pave the way for the country's economic recovery after lost an estimated 2 million jobs during the pandemic. And China continues to record high numbers of daily COVID-19 cases, and the country today reported more than 16,000 confirmed and asymptomatic cases. This is one of the highest numbers in 2 years due to the new outbreak of the Omicron variant, with the epicenter being Shanghai, the country's financial center, and home to 26 million people.
China's bustling, fast-paced mega city of Shanghai has come to a halt to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Nearly all of its 26 million people have been confined to try to curb the worst outbreak of the new coronavirus in China since the pandemic broke out in 2020. Shanghai, China's second most populous city and its main financial center, stepped up epidemiological control measures after registering more than 13,000 cases of infection in a single day, most being asymptomatic. After originally adopting a more sectoral approach aimed at minimizing economic disruption, Shanghai imposed broader restrictions as the authorities struggled to contain the resurgence associated with the Omicron variant. Yesterday, the number of newly reported local cases that tested positive for COVID-19 exceeded 10,000 for the first time in Shanghai, reaching 13,354. Since March, Shanghai has reported more than 73,000 cases that tested positive in the current wave of infections. The Omicron variant can quickly disseminate with a longer incubation period at present. The epidemic situation in Shanghai is highly volatile and extremely volatile. While its sectoral quarantine was initially reported, the containment measures now cover more than 25 million people after restrictions were extended until further notice and new rounds of mass nucleic acid testing were initiated to find all those infected, especially those without symptoms. Public transport is suspended from one side of a city to the other, including metro, buses, taxis, and ferries, as well as private vehicles. Rapid antigen tests are also being distributed to households. Nearly 40,000 health professionals and military doctors from different parts of China are arriving in Shanghai to help the metropolis deal with the outbreak, in what Chinese authorities have described as the largest nationwide medical operation since the closure of Wuhan in early 2020. While the rest of the world tries to live with the virus, China maintains its zero-COVID policy and assures that it will do whatever is necessary to prevent the spread of the virus. At the same time, it has softened its approach in some respects to avoid disruptions to the domestic economy and global trade.
In Yemen, the government and Houthi forces accuse each other of violating the truce that came into effect last Saturday. According to Foreign Minister Ahmed Awad bin Mubarak, the ceasefire is threatened by Houthi violations, including military deployment, mobilization of troops and vehicles, and drone attacks. The army also accused the insurgents of violating the truce after attacking several regions. The Houthi rebels on the other side reported dozens of incursions by government reconnaissance planes in the provinces of Marib, Hiyah, Zeda, and Lah. The rebels reported at least 36 bombardments with missiles and artillery against their positions. The international community of the Red Cross head of global operations, Dominic Stillhart, warned that the conflict, drought, soaring food and fuel prices, as well as the adverse effects of the pandemic on markets across the countries in Africa have compounded the hunger problem.
Where an estimated 346 million people are affected by food insecurity. That is 1/4 of the population of the continent. The current food security crisis is clearly the result of combined effects of conflict. Think about the Sahel in particular. Think about Ethiopia, that's been affected by a serious conflict in the past couple of years. But it is also the effect of repeated climate shocks. The Horn of Africa is experiencing its worst drought in years after 3 failed rainy seasons.
And Sri Lanka's protesters gathered at Independence Memorial Hall and in front of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's office in Colombo on Monday, demanding his resignation amid worsening shortages of food, fuel, and medicines. Demonstrations have been taking place across the country of 22 million people despite emergency laws, allowing the detention of participants and a curfew that expired on Monday morning. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka's parliament will session again on Tuesday for the first time since the state of emergency was imposed to contain a wave of protests and demands for the president's resignation. The lack of foreign currency brought serious difficulties in meeting its $51 billion foreign debt maturities, which was aggravated by the reduction of income in key sectors such as tourism and remittances that were severely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And Colombo Archbishop Malcolm Ranjith led about 700 priests and nuns in the Solidarity March in Sri Lanka's capital as street protests continue over the government's handling of the country's economic crisis. And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you find so inclined, please join us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.